Welcome to this edition of Footprints in American History. Today, we're going to talk about the traitor's wife. Now, many of you probably already know who Benedict Arnold was. He was a traitor to his country. He was definitely not respected. However, many people probably are not aware of one of the people that was behind a lot of this, and that was Margaret Shippen, better known as Peggy. Now, Peggy Shippen was from Philadelphia. She was raised in a very nice lifestyle. She came from aristocracy. Her father was a judge. Her mother was also very used to aristocracy also. And what happened was they were both, during the Revolutionary War, they were both very loyal to the British Crown. However, her father, being a judge, was actually a very wise man. He understood the importance of keeping his mouth shut and not getting super political with his viewpoints and getting very loud about it. So he kept his mouth shut even though he was loyal to the crown during the Revolution. So as a result, that ended up paying off very well for him, because 1777, the British controlled the city. However, 1778, he had to deal with an American administration. So one way or another, he had to keep his mouth shut, and it paid off. He didn't even have a lot of resistance from any of the locals. So during this time, he had several daughters, and Peggy was the youngest of them. Unlike the other daughters, however, she had an interest in politics. During the time of the British occupation, she had also met many of the British. They were occupying the city. She had become friends with some of them, and one of them that she had become friends with was a guy named Major John Andre. Now, he was a spymaster for the British, and they ended up, according to what a lot of people believe, they had some romantic involvement. How much is probably not very well known, but it was strongly believed that there was some romantic involvement with them. So a year later, Americans now control the city, and what happens is that George Washington assigns Benedict Arnold control of the city. During the time there, he meets Peggy Shippen. They fall in love. Now, her father, even though he was loyal to the crown, and he's also concerned about the age difference because he's 38, Benedict Arnold is, and she's 18, he still consented to their marriage, even though he had reservations. So during this time, Benedict Arnold is becoming increasingly frustrated with his time with the Continental Army. He had a lot of reasons for resentment. Part of it was the fact that he had been passed over for 5 promotions in the in the American Army. And what happened was he felt that this was kind of a slight against him. However, there was also a lot of arguments that he had some unethical business dealings, that he was trying to profit off of his command in Philadelphia. So a lot of people were not very pleased with him. And a lot of the men in the Continental Army did not even really trust him. Turns out later on, when he was in the British Army, the same thing. Many of his fellow officers didn't necessarily trust him. George Washington was an exception, though. They had become friends, and George Washington, the commander of the Continental Army, actually had a great admiration for him. And before the Revolution, Benedict Arnold was actually quite a good businessman. However, he also made some foolish decisions during that. So during this time in Philadelphia, he had been accused of using that command to help profit himself. So as the time goes, he's getting upset about this. Now, Washington had learned about some of these unethical dealings, and he ended up reprimanding, not very harshly though, because of the friendship, he ended up reprimanding Benedict Arnold. Arnold still had a little bit of a grudge against George Washington because of that reprimand. However, during this time, what happened was George Washington in 1780, shortly afterward, had offered him command of West Point. Now, West Point was not a service academy back then. West Point was a military fort, and it was a very strategically located fort. Now, during all of this time in Philadelphia, what happened was the resentment against the military was growing. Here's Peggy. She's married to this man, and she sees the resentment in him. Well, wives had a tremendous power over their husbands, men that were in command especially. They had a tremendous power over their husbands, and Peggy was no exception. So what happened was she sees this resentment, she sees this anger, and what happens is she still has British contacts. So through a series of other people, she ends up putting him in contact with Major John Andre with the British Army. So in the end, Benedict Arnold decides, okay, I'm going to defect. So he makes this decision, but they still have to communicate somewhat. Now he's been offered command of West Point, so he makes a decision. He's going to give West Point to the British. So he makes this decision, then he learns Washington is going to visit the fort. So he makes plans on top of that for Washington to be captured. Part of the plan as far as with giving West Point to the British was he was going to weaken the Continental Army while they were there, so that it would make sure that the British had a better chance at achieving a victory and capturing the fort. However, they had to communicate. So they started communicating by letter. Now they would put in a mundane letter, they would put invisible ink and they would use code. So the way they would do these coded messages was they both had dictionaries in common, and the codes would refer to page numbers of the dictionary as well as certain words, and those words would spell out the message in the invisible ink. So here are these plans that are going to the British. So here's John Andre, and he's got to get to his commanders. He's got to get these plans. So Benedict Arnold instructs him, it probably would be better if you dress in civilian clothes instead of your British uniform, because it makes you a lot less noticeable. So Andre agrees, and he goes on his way. Well, what happens is Andre, on his way to his commanders, gets intercepted by some militiamen, and they start speaking to them. They're really suspicious. So what happens is Arnold had instructed them, put this information in your boot. So this way they're not going to be likely to see it. Well, what happens is the militia tell him, take off your boots. They're searching him. And that's when they discover the plans. What happens is shortly after that, the information gets to George Washington about what's going to happen and what Benedict Arnold is up to. Unfortunately, Peggy was left out in the wind a little bit on this, because she was with Washington that morning, and they were going to have breakfast when Washington gets the news. So Peggy is now scared. So she throws herself into Washington's arms, and she's pleading innocent, pleading innocent, and he's innocent, says all these things, and she's just terrified, but she puts up a good enough act that Washington ends up letting her go. So once she gets out free, she makes her way to join her husband in New York, and they are now with the British. So as time went after that, he ends up getting his command. Now, he made the British promise him a very handsome, he wanted to be treated very well. In other words, he wanted a lot of money. And so the British promised him a tidy little sum for West Point. So he ends up now getting a command with the British Army. He had been a general with the Continental Army. Now he was a general with the British Army. He had several fights with the Continental Army after that, and he had a lot of victories. However, none of them were really significant. It was nothing like what he was used to when he was fighting under the Continental Army. And because of it, Washington had a great respect for him. Washington was one of the few people that genuinely liked Benedict Arnold, and he actually really thought very highly of him, unlike a lot of the other officers. So he has these victories. Well, the revolution ends, and now the British have lost. So Benedict Arnold and Peggy and their children go back to England. Now, while they're in England, Peggy meets the Queen. queen gives her quite a reward. Not only does she give Peggy a reward, but she gives her a pension. Now, Arnold had also gotten a pension, and he had also gotten some money, but the British never paid him the amount of money they promised him. I'm sure a lot of it was because of what happened. As far as the British attitudes toward Benedict Arnold in England, the British were mostly ambivalent toward him. However, there was some resentment from some of the British because they really liked John Andre. And because of that, they felt that he was responsible for his death. Now, real quick about John Andre, when he was captured by the militia, they said that he was a very charming man. He had a lot of personality, and even his own enemies liked him. So when they executed him, they had to execute him as a spy, first of all, because he was dressed in civilian clothes. If he had been dressed in a British uniform, then he would have been executed as an enemy combatant. So in the end, he got hanged instead of shot, which was his desire. So now, here's what's happening is that Benedict Arnold had been a successful businessman before the war. Now he's trying to do business, and he's trying to do deals again to make money. However, he's also making some foolish decisions in there, so he's also running up debt. He goes to Canada. He learns about some business dealings. He does some business dealings over there. He came back to England, and shortly after that, he decided to go back. Well, the second time he went to Canada, the Canadians knew who he was, and they were not pleased with him, and he got a very, very harsh reception. They did not like him. They ended up leaving. Now, they also went to Philadelphia to see her parents. Once again, word gets out that Benedict Arnold is in town, so both of them received this terrible reception when they come to Philadelphia. Her father had great influence, but even his influence did not make a difference as far as when Benedict Arnold came into town with Peggy. So they end up going back to England. She did get to meet the Queen, as I stated, and they ended up living their life out with their children after that. Peggy did die of cancer a few years after Benedict, but neither of them really had a very prosperous or happy life after that. They ended up having a beautiful home in Britain. However, what happened was it ended up becoming a rental property for a while, and she ended up selling property from Benedict Arnold afterward to pay off the debts he had run, because he had incurred some debt along the way, and she needed to get rid of that debt. So in the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed this story. I hope you guys will like and share the video. I also hope that you'll subscribe to the channel, ring the bell if you want to see notifications for future videos. Also, I have a Facebook page called Footprints in American History. Feel free to check it out. You'll learn about past videos as well as upcoming videos. And also check out my other channel called Just a Bit Outside. Type in Just a Bit Outside channel and it'll take you to it. You'll have a lot of videos that are not American history related. Some of them are history related, but they're just not going to be American related. And in the meantime, I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks so much, and fair winds and following seas.
Just a bit outside.